Potiphar's prison, right? Remember that? And he had been, if you remember, he had been sold by his brothers as a slave, was made a slave in Egypt. Then, because of his Potiphar's wife, who basically attempted to seduce Joseph, and Joseph did not give in to the temptation. She claimed that he tried to forcibly rape her, and thus he was thrown in prison. Again, if you remember, as I said last week, I can't be dogmatic about it, but I think the fact that he was not immediately executed right there on the spot by the guy who's the captain of the prison, or captain of Pharaoh's officers, or whatever, this guy who's a high-ranking, who's obviously over a prison, who's obviously in charge of making sure people get put to death. For some reason, he doesn't do that with Joseph, which makes me believe that he doesn't buy the whole story, but has to make it look good at least by getting rid of Joseph. And I imagine to his own grief had to get rid of Joseph because of the fact, if you remember, Joseph was a benefit to his home, his house. So, and there we see that in the prison, he rises to prominence because of the fact that God's favor is upon him. Anybody remember the two people we meet? What's their names, or what's their titles? Baker and the butler. And they're Pharaoh's baker and butler, right? And they're in prison. Again, I'm just assuming they're there because of a common charge that they both seem to have been at least be connected to, maybe trying to do something to the Pharaoh, assassinate the Pharaoh, whatever. And Joseph interprets their dream. One gets out, goes. Well, both of them get out. One gets out in a good way, one gets out in a bad way, right? And which one is brought back to Pharaoh's palace? Butler or baker? Anybody remember? The butler, yeah, and the baker's the one that has his head removed and his body hung up on a tree and birds eat. All right, so now he's forgotten in prison. He's going to be forgotten there for 2 more years, as we'll see here in the passage. This is after the event of him interpreting the dream. So open up your Bibles to Genesis 41. Genesis 41. And we're going to look at verses 1 through 36. So if I can get some readers who will read around the room. Bill, 1 through 5, 6 through 10. Darla, 11 through 15. Fred, 16 to 20. Genesis 41. 16 to 20. Did I say, Fred, you had 16 to 20? I thought I said you're 6 to 10. He was 11 to 15. 16 to 20. 16 to 20. 21 to 35. Okay, Stephen. Or 21 to 35. 21 to 25. 26 to 30. I'm on, readers. All right. 31 to 36. I give the longest one to the last person. All right, Bill, go ahead. Is he? Oh, yeah, you're reading. Okay, we'll stop you there. Go ahead, pick up. He's an eager reader.
Plenty shall not be known in the land by the reason of that famine known following, for it shall be very frequent. For that the dream was spoken into Pharaoh's flight. It is because the thing is established by God. God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and set him up over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the fifth part of the land of Egypt in the 20th years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the city. And that food shall be for store to land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine.
Okay, so how long has Joseph been in prison now? At least so far, 2 years, and probably a little longer because of the rising to prominence in that, but at least 2 years after the whole event of the interpreting of the two prisoners' dreams. Okay, the Nile River is mentioned here in this passage that we looked at. Does anybody know maybe a little bit of background to the Egyptian culture, how significant the Nile River was to them, spiritually speaking to them, and maybe physically speaking? Anybody got any idea on that? Anybody ever heard that? They did have, obviously they used it to irrigate all their crops, and they actually looked at it as a sacred river, a lot like you would see in India and other places where they do things of that nature. And they looked at it as a river that represented the cycles of life because it had annual flooding that came out and flooded the fields and worked at obviously providing fertility to that area. If you look on a map, you'll see it's all green around the Nile River. You ever notice, if you ever look on an actual, like a satellite map, you'll see that. It might be, yeah. All right. Anybody know how Pharaoh was in that time viewed? Like a god, or a son of a god, if you will. Now that is significant in this dream now. That gives us some background to understand what they thought of the Nile, what they thought of Pharaoh. So what do we see happening in these dreams? Just kind of summarize it. Something's going to come out of the Nile that's going to bring plenteousness, right, for a time. But then something's also going to come out of the Nile that's going to bring famine for a long time. And the fact that Pharaoh can't even figure it out. Does that not tell you something? that God is already starting to show himself about the nation of Israel and him being the God over all the nations of the world. That Pharaoh's not all that he might appear himself to be. Now I'll say this, Pharaoh's not at this point unfriendly to the people of Israel right now. This is, obviously we got years to go and new pharaohs that are going to come on the scene where we see the unfriendliness of the pharaohs. But a big part of what you see happening in the Exodus is really God showing that he's more powerful than all the gods that they trust in. Every time something happens around, it's like God is saying, I'm greater than that God. When the frogs come out of the Nile, I'm greater than that. I'm greater than the animal life. They had a God for that. I'm greater than the hail or the sky that has the power of the weather. I'm greater than that. I'm greater than the sun. They actually had a God they worshiped called the God Ra, and he puts the sun out for a time, which that's an interesting one in and of itself there. And then he finally attacks the God of Egypt, the final God of Egypt. He attacks his son, destroys the firstborn of Pharaoh, right? So he's making it very clear that I'm greater than that. And don't miss that. That's imagery is starting to play out here when this happens. Now, Pharaoh, after these dreams, he has it. What's his demeanor or his attitude? It says the spirit was troubled. Spirit was troubled because he can't figure it out. And you think about it, if this guy is a god or a son of a god, how come he doesn't know the interpretation of the dream? Why does he even have to have wise men do the interpreting for him if he supposedly is a god? He doesn't have that ability to interpret the dreams. And again, none of the wise men have the interpretation of the dream either. And who's responsible for bringing Joseph back out of the prison? The butler, his testimony, right? All of a sudden it dawned on him, I know a guy who knows how to interpret dreams. Yeah, he forgot about him. Now, interesting to note, when Joseph is he's cleaned up, he's brought before the Pharaoh, how does Joseph respond when Pharaoh says, you can interpret dreams, right? How does Joseph respond? I don't interpret dreams, but interpretation belongs to God. And he makes that clear multiple times in this account, that God is the one who interprets dreams. God is the one who deserves the glory in all of this. And again, playing out that God is greater than Pharaoh. Okay, and God is greater than the nation of Egypt and all the gods that they worship in the nation of Egypt as well. So he calls him that. All right, so what kind of, what does it mean when it says there that the dream was repeated? What Joseph actually makes a note about the fact that the dream was said in two parts. He says it's one dream, but it's repeated in two different forms. Yeah. Well, he says in verse 32, look at 32. He says, as for this dream, it was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God, and it will shortly bring it to pass. And God will shortly bring it to pass. So the idea is to establish the fact that this is from God, this is determined to happen, and it will happen soon. Just kind of giving a double emphasis. Sometimes people say, if God says it once, it's enough, but if God says it twice, you better take heed to it. And God says it twice here to Pharaoh in such a way that he wants him to get the point that this is not something that you need to overlook, like having pizza before you go to bed and have a weird dream at night, right? Okay, this is something you need to get, that this is not the average dream. Okay, let's kind of blend these two together here for a moment. Fat cows and fat ears of corn. Now, when we think of ears of corn, I want you to not think Bill's farm. Okay, you'll see that corn is actually used to describe the word grain. So you'll see the Bible actually calls it a grain of wheat or a corn of wheat, actually used that way in that language, which is a way of saying a grain of something. So when you hear corn and you think, well, boy, this got 7 ears on that stalk, man, I need to go back to that time, because you get about 3 on yours, right? 2 or 3? Normally 1. Yeah, so this isn't the same kind of crop, okay? We understand that. This is more like wheat that we're talking about. So you got all these ears on this stalk. The fat ears on this nice stalk, and the fat cows, what do they represent? They represent plenty, and the fact that you got the number 7 represents what? 7 years, okay? And then you have the 7 lean cows and lean ears. What does that represent? 7 years of famine. And it's not just that in the dream. What else happens in the dream? They devour the 7 fat, right? And it's a way of saying that the famine's going to be so severe that you won't even recognize we'd ever had a time of great bounty by the time this thing's over with. It's going to have drained the land, destroyed the land. Okay? What did Joseph do after he gives the interpretation of the dream? This part is not in the dream. Joseph just tells Pharaoh something. Real loud, I can't hear you. Yeah, he actually gives specifics about what you should do. He says, save back 1/5 of the grain every year. Appoint a man who will do that. That'll save back 1/5 of the grain, so then the years of famine, you'll have grain to supply. Now, how did Joseph figure that one out so quickly? Yeah, God. The reason why he rose to prominence in Potiphar's house, the reason why he rose to prominence in the jail, is the same thing happening here. We see the wisdom of Joseph, that he's a very wise man. And we're going to see some things happen here in just a moment that'll show you some things here. Now, at the end of this dream, again, Pharaoh suggests that, is there anybody that's able to interpret a dream like this? And what does Joseph do, again, to pull away from the spotlight being on him? Yeah, he points to the fact that God is the source of the interpretation, and that he's not seeking the glory at all. He once again makes that clear. Is this a normal standard for people in the way they answer people when they get praise given toward them? We all want to take credit. Look what I did here. Look what I did here. Look how great I am. That's just the nature of sinful man, to want to be glorified. But the nature of a humble person that's trying to honor God is that they deflect their honor. They deflect their glory that's given to them and try to give it and aim it back toward the Father. Okay? So again, I'll ask the question, if Pharaoh was a god or a son of the god, should he have been able to interpret the dream? Probably, most likely. And once again, we find out that this is making it very clear that a foreign god to the nation of Egypt is a greater god than Pharaoh and all the gods, as we will see in the book of Exodus. Okay? Let's go on, look at verses 37 to 57 there. We're going to read down a little bit further. Get some readers again. 37, I'll just do to 45. We're going to give you a long run there. Okay, 37 to 45, and then 46 to 50. You want to do that one? Uh-huh. And then 51, and I'll give you a long run at the last here to 57. Let's do that one. Stephen back there in the back. Okay. Okay, go ahead. 37, yes, to 45. Mm-hmm. 45.
And Pharaoh called Joseph's name
Zaphnath Paneah.
and he gave him to wife
Asenath,
the daughter of
Potiphera.
and Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt.
Okay.
Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. And in 7 plenteous years the earth brought forth by handfuls. He gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities, the food of the field, which was round about every city, laid he up to the same. And Joseph gathered round corn as the sand of the sea, very much, until he left numbering without number. One more. And
Yep.
unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, which Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, preached upon Pharaoh unto him.
Okay.
And Joseph called the name of the firstborn
Manasseh.
Manasseh. For God said he hath made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second called Ephraim, for God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. And the 7 years of plenteousness that was in the land of Egypt were ended, and the 7 years of dearth began to come, according as Joseph had said. And the dearth was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And in all the land of Egypt was famine. The people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph, what he saith to you do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold them to the Egyptians. And the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And all the countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because the famine was so sore in all lands.
Okay. So, what two things does Pharaoh commend Joseph for? Okay, he mentions that there the Spirit of God is with him. Yeah, he mentions here, look at how he says it. He says, for much, he mentions the fact that he's discreet. Did anybody see that word? Where was that at? Yeah, 39. Pharaoh said, for as much as God has showed unto thee, there is none so discreet and wise as thou. So, obviously he does recognize that the spirit of the gods or the God. There's a later part we'll see that used again in the Exodus where that's referred. We'll see that even used in the book of Daniel where they say something about Daniel having the spirit of the holy gods running him. And there's a very parallel storyline that plays out in the book of Daniel that's happening here. Anybody remember Nebuchadnezzar and his dreams? And that he can't interpret them? And his interpreters can't interpret them? Actually, just to try to make sure he's not being befuddled by his wise men who are just making up interpretations as they go. He says, if you're really as wise as you are, just tell me my dream first, and then I'll know that you can tell me the interpretation. I mean, that's and the wise men said, there's never been a person who's ever asked for that. And he says, well, if you can't give me the answer, then you're going to die. Remember that? That was his way of dealing with it. And Daniel not only gives the dream, but he gives the interpretation, and he's referred to very similar in the same way that Pharaoh refers to. And he's exalted in high power because of it as well. He's exalted as the chief of the wise men, and it appears to be like second or third in command at a later point in his life over the nation of, not Babylon, but it'd be Persia at that point, at least under the King Darius. So quite a neat parallel going on here. God sometimes has a way of setting his own people in high positions of power, doesn't he? So, what was Pharaoh's command to Joseph? Yeah, you're going to be second under me. Everything. Basically, does this sound like it sounds similar to the same thing we've heard everywhere else? He was put under Potiphar, right under Potiphar. Then he was put right under the jailer, and now he's put right under Pharaoh. It just keeps rising to power like that. And just an amazing account happening here. How did Pharaoh signify Joseph's authority? So that when people see Joseph, remember now, I want you to think about it. Joseph's a foreigner. And if anybody remembers anything else about him, he once was a slave. And if anybody else knows more details about him, he once was in prison. And now he's second in command. You're going to have people that might have issues with that. Right? They're going to look for some fault in him. So how is he going to, I guess, have some authority that's signified here? Gives him the ring of Pharaoh. Got to ride in the second. So think about the second chariot. It's like, you know, you got Air Force One. Is there like an Air Force Two? Is that how that goes, I think, for the vice president? Something of that. I'm pretty sure there is something like that. That's kind of what's going on here. There's a chariot number 2, and this is the second in command. This guy rides in that one. So I don't know if it said it on the side of the chariot. Second, you know, chariot 2. You better stay away from chariot 2. All right? Okay. All right. How did the people respond to Joseph? What were they told to do, at least? Bow down to him and cry before him, to honor him. That again is similar to what we see happening in the book of Daniel. It's also what we see happening in the book of Esther with Mordecai. Anybody remember that? With Mordecai, and that he's put in a position of honor, and he's got to have people bowing down to him, and he honestly doesn't even want that, if you remember. And he goes right after the king delights to honor in Mordecai, who had saved his life, and he says, "This is the king this is the man that the king delights to honor in," and everybody's bowed down. And right after the whole thing's over with, he goes right back to his post to go back to work. He's like, this isn't really my attitude of heart that I want to get all this honor for myself. But he surely wasn't going to show it to the other guy, right? Remember Haman? Haman wanted everybody to bow down to him, and he wasn't going to show that to him. Joseph's name is changed, and the name is Zaphnath-Paneah. Does anybody have Bible notes in your Bible that gives an interpretation of that name? Anybody got that? I'll give you the interpretation of the name. It's not a specific interpretation. There's some debate over the meaning of it, but one of them is the nourisher of two lands, the living one, or the savior of the lands. And that's the title he gets for doing for being who he is. Now, think about it. He's been very clear about wanting to make sure that God gets the glory, yet at the same time the world's trying to give him the glory. Do you think that's hard? Yeah. Now, we're told also how old Joseph was at this point. Verse 46. How old was he? He's 30. Anybody remember how old he was when he was sold as a slave, brought into Egypt? 17. So how many years have passed? Do your math. 30 minus 17. 13 years have passed. And he's been in a position of, as he called it, affliction. Later on in this passage, he's been in a place of affliction for 13 years, waiting, not even knowing what was going to happen, that God was going to exalt him to this position of power. And then he has two sons. And Joseph names them specific names there. And we know them later. They're two tribes of Israel. They're the two half-tribes of Israel, Manasseh and Ephraim. Right? And Manasseh, he gets the name Manasseh, which means God has made me to forget all my toil through this. That in the midst of all the trouble and all the difficulty he's gone through for the last 13 years, Manasseh was a reminder that God has taken that all away. He's caused you to forget that, to no longer live under that burden anymore. Yes? Yeah. You know, you would imagine that probably there was an influence upon. even though it doesn't say it here, there's probably an influence since he's acknowledged God in all that he's done up to this point, and even people have acknowledged that God is with him, the God of, they just call him, they have acknowledged that the Lord is with him. I'm imagining Joseph didn't just marry her and let her go off in her pagan rites and her pagan lifestyle that she was born into and brought up in, that probably she became a believer in the same God that he was. By the way, here's a thought. Why does you think that Pharaoh appointed her to be his wife? Because he does. If you look at it, it says that he gets her for him. Uh-huh. If we're gonna get him assimilated into or being received by the people, he's got to be married into a royal line somewhere, and this is it. And it turns out that she's the one. Ephraim, what's the name mean there? So not only has he forgotten the past, but he's also become very fruitful in the present as well. Aren't you glad that there are times that you go through dark times and that you look back on it years later and you go, man, I forgot how bad that was. But there's been so many good things in my life that's happened that's helped me not to remember and live in that anymore. And that's exactly what's happening here for Joseph. That he went through a time, a 13-year spell where he was basically treated as an outcast. And he, like I said last week, he was like the cream of the crop. He just rose up everywhere he went. He never seemed to stay down in the low spot, and he didn't let it hold him down. And God was with him in the midst of that. And now he's at a place that he names his children in remembrance of the fact that God has taken away all of this and given him a place of honor. All right. In light of all that we read today, who gets the credit for saving so many people from the famine? Joseph's getting the credit by the people for the most part, but Joseph is continually trying to point people back to God as being the one who did this. In fact, that's what he will say, and I've referenced this verse several times as well in our lessons here, that at the end he says to the people, to his brothers, what you meant for evil, God meant for good, to save much people alive. God intended this to work out this way for his purpose. So Joseph was careful about recognizing that God is the one responsible for this. Now, there is something else we need to think about. There's a tension that oftentimes you'll hear theologians talk about when it comes to the sovereignty of God working and running everything together here, and that is that even though there's the sovereignty of God, there is responsibility of man. And both are playing hand in hand with each other. That God expects us to walk in obedience. He doesn't say, well, I'm sovereign over everything, I'm in control of everything, sit down and do nothing and let me run the show. That's not how he works. He puts responsibility into our hands, and we are to act in that responsibility, and he holds us accountable to that responsibility as well. And I would say that's what's going on here with Joseph, is that he recognizes it's God who's brought him to this place. It's God who's exalted him, God who caused him to forget, God who's made him abundant, God who gave the interpretation of the dream, all of these kinds of things. He's acknowledged that God is sovereign over it all, but at the same time, he's been absolutely obedient to what God would have him to do. And the fact that, you remember we talked about last week where Potiphar's wife tried to basically seduce him, and he did what was right, even though he possibly could have got away with it. Did what was right, because he cared about obeying. All right, I'm going to give you a couple things here. Now, first off, I want to do this one first. The remains of Joseph. Do we need to have extra biblical sources, and I'm meaning extra meaning outside of the Bible sources, to verify that the Bible's true and trustworthy? Is the Bible true and trustworthy regardless of whether we have those or not? Yeah. Okay, and so I'm going to give you some things that are outside of the Bible just to show you that this can be trusted or it is trustworthy, but we don't need these as a means in which to prove the Bible's true. So there's some quotes. I'm going to, TJ, if you'll take these, pass them out real quick to everybody. These are some quotes from some ancient times in Egypt. They actually come from the Egyptian time that would fit where Joseph would have been at, that actually refer to somebody similar to Joseph. His name is not mentioned as Joseph, and his name is not mentioned as Zaphnath-Paneah, but the characteristics around everything seems to be similar, okay? And by the way, has anybody ever noticed that in the Bible that you'll see that rulers have more than one name? I know Bill's asked me several times about, how come he's named here this way or named that way? Because they have more than one name, okay? And that's possible in what you're going to read here in just a moment, okay? First off, Fred, if I can get you to read those that first paragraph for us to start us off. Got one for you. Got one for you. Okay. Okay, for each of the following quotes from historians about Mentuhotep, identify the biblical phrases that correspond to what is claimed about Joseph. Okay, who wants to read that first quote? It's Mentuhotep. Okay, that's how you say the name if you're having trouble reading that one. Who wants to read the first quote? TJ, you going to read it real loud for us? Personages. Palace. Royal palace. Okay. So what's this Mentuhotep require? He's called the alter ego of the king. What's that mean? Really? Like he's number 2 with the king. And it says that he arrived, which is a way of saying he was not part of the nation of Egypt. He arrived, and then when he did arrive, how was he treated? He was bowed down before. And there are people that actually believe that describes this Mentuhotep might actually be Joseph from that time. Okay, again, can't be dogmatic, but just going on that one. Okay, look at the next quote. Who wants to read the next one? Bill. Mentuhotep, Sesostris. Okay, so here we have Pharaoh gives this, who's Sesostris the first, that's Pharaoh. He gives this Mentuhotep power to act in his place. Do you see that? He says, when he also held the office of the chief treasurer as the powerful vizier Mentuhotep under Sesostris I, the account which he could give himself read like a declaration of the king's power. So in other words, when he talked of himself, he spoke with the authority of the king. Do you get that? Does anybody remember somebody that was outside of Egypt, that was brought into Egypt, that was given power of the king of Egypt? Joseph. So that's possible that he fits into that. Okay. The following transcriptions of carvings found in the Nile Valley, how might they relate to Joseph? Okay, we got another quote here. Who wants to read this one? Okay, Darla. And this is a inscription on the tomb of a mini governor under Sesostris I. So you remember that it's not just Mentuhotep and Sesostris I. He's got obviously leaders under him as well. And this leader under him is saying that he actually helped preserve people during the days of the famine. And the leader is obviously, this, it said that the timing fits under the same person, doesn't it? If it says Sostres the first, that this is the Pharaoh we're talking about, and Mentuhotep is actually the Joseph, this guy, what's his name here? Amini, the governor under Sostres the first, no doubt would have had that carved on his tomb as that he was a helper to save his people in that region from the famine, because he was under the leadership of Mentuhotep. Okay? Next one. Yes.
I was in mourning on my throne. Those of the palace were in grief. My heart was in great affliction. Because Happy, the river god, had failed to come in time in a period of 7 years. Grain was scant, kernels were dried up, scarce was every kind of food. Every man robbed his twin, those who entered did not go. Children cried, youngsters fell, the hearts of the old were grieving. Legs drawn up, they hugged the ground, their arms clasped about them. Courtiers were needy, temples were shut, shrines covered with dust. Everyone was in distress.
And this was an inscription on Hungry Rock, which is another thing. So you have people talking about, and this one appears to be maybe coming out of Pharaoh or something that Pharaoh said, I was on my throne. And what's he crying about? A time of famine that's lasting how long? 7 years. Now that's found, you could go into Egypt and find these things, or go into historical spots that have taken this stuff out of the land of Egypt and find things like this that do appear to go correlate with what the Bible says. Right? Isn't that interesting? Okay, so do you think these pieces of evidence prove a compelling support to persuade a skeptic? Hear the whole question. Well, why do all the kings use different names in the Bible? I don't know. Because they mean different things, I guess. I'm not sure. Huh? Maybe, possible. But my question here, the question in this paper here is, would this be enough to persuade a skeptic? How many people do you think, how many skeptics do you think have read this, read quotes like this, and have said, that doesn't fit? Yeah, skeptics are skeptics by choice, not by evidence. Okay? Here's another one. How does this evidence support what you believe about Joseph? Does it help you? We don't need it, though. It's yes, no. I can't prove that it's one way or the other anyways. You know, one, I'm not an Egyptologist that knows inside details about every little thing about Egypt, and I don't need to know all of that to prove whether the Bible's true or not, because the Bible's true whether I believe it or whether I believe it or I have evidence to back it up. Okay? Yeah, long time. Yeah. Does anybody remember there was another famine that lasted 6 years in the land of Israel under another guy named Ahab? You remember Elijah said it's not going to rain until I say so? It doesn't rain, and I think it was 6.5 years, if I remember right. Here's one more I want to show you. This one is interesting as well. This isn't a bunch of quotes. This is actually a map of some things. You go ahead and take it, and I want you to see this one as well. No. So I said it doesn't. I can't be dogmatic about who this person is, and neither can any of the people that go on the other side be dogmatic about who the Mentuhotep was. Sostres the first, they know, but. Yeah, it's possible that they named it according to an event, just like he did here with his boys, that he named them according to an event. And maybe kings did that. Or they got, now I'll give you a Caesar. You remember Caesar? Julius Caesar? And then you go into the one during the days of Christ. What is his name? Augustus. Caesar Augustus. Do you know neither one of those are his name? Augustus is not his name. His name was it wasn't that. Augustus actually came out of a title that he was given, or a descriptor of the Caesar. It means the august one, the honored one, and he got the title Augustus because of it. So I forget what his name was, but he had his name actually changed 3 times before you even get to Caesar Augustus under that. So, is it possible Mentuhotep might have been an Egyptian name that they gave him for a certain reason? Possible. I don't know. I wasn't there, can't tell you. But it's interesting that he does fit the same characteristics, though. All right, here's the next one. Joseph's Canal. Now, this one is quite an interesting thought. The lake known as Lake Moeris, or Birket Korun, and is supplied by the remnant of Joseph's Canal, which is called Bar Yusuf, which was the long canal constructed in the 12th dynasty of Egypt, possibly under the direction of Joseph to relieve the famine. It runs parallel to the Nile, following from a dam at the modern city of Assuit. Okay? The canal flows over 200 miles to the Fayum Oasis and supplies the farmlands along the way with water. And that name is still there today. That canal's still there, and it's still called, if you translate it into English, Joseph's Canal. And nobody knows why it's called that. Now, how in the world do you get that name there? And nobody knows how he got the name. Interesting. So there's a little bit more evidence that you might say that might give a little bit more of a strong persuasion there. Now, I can't be dogmatic on any of that outside evidence. The only thing I can be dogmatic is about what does this book say, right? And what this book says is what we rely on as true, okay? All right, so let's finish with some questions, and then we're done for this morning with Sunday school. Yes, sir. Yeah, the Bar Yusuf is Joseph's Canal. It's the canal, the 200-mile canal that comes off the Nile River and goes into the Fayum Oasis. No, it's that dotted line that you're seeing. That's Joseph's Canal. Yeah, Tripler Farm Ground. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody remember the patterns of evidence, the Exodus? And that's actually one of the details they pointed to, the fact that Joseph had to have been there, was the Bar Yosef, or the Joseph's Canal, which is what it means. So that gives pretty strong evidence that this is probably this was created probably in the days of Joseph, or made in the days of Joseph, and it honored Joseph as well. There's a lot more to it. Just go and look on that. If you remember that patterns of evidence, if you want to watch that show sometime again, I know we've watched all of them that have been up to this point, been seen. But that's a neat one that they spend the time to go and look at that. There's other incidences that they find in burial lands that appear that there is somebody that is a non-Egyptian that was honored with a Pharaoh-type tomb. And inside the Pharaoh-type tomb, they see this statue of a man with a colored garment, a multicolored garment in the tomb. And what they don't find in the tomb also correlates with the Bible. They find no body in there. And if you remember what Joseph said is, when we leave here, take my body out of here. So that's an interesting. You don't have grave robbers stealing bones. I imagine the story was probably still around. What do you think? Did anybody think that might have gotten to the ears of Pharaoh? Yeah, how did you get here? You remember? Yeah, maybe. Yeah. So it became a significant thing to remember Joseph by. And even the statue itself, he's got a shepherd's staff on his shoulder, or a shepherd's club on his shoulder, which shows that he was not an Egyptian. It was something that He was more like an Aramaic, somebody who comes from the northern lands of Canaan area, or Semitic, I think is what they call them. So, all right, number one. Number one, as you look back over Joseph's life so far, what themes do you see in the text? That God was with him. Any others? Gave God the glory. He was obedient. God made him very wise. I like this one. He trusted God through it. You don't ever see any bit of Joseph throwing a fit and mad that he's in this place. Does that mean he didn't have those days? He never had those days? I guess he probably had a few times those days, but it doesn't seem to be the prominent nature of Joseph that's recorded in Scripture.
I think like his 13 years of dark, he didn't know the future, brother. You're all saying how he trusted God, and he came from such a dysfunctional family, but God, it's amazing the glory God gives us.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing story. Yep. Number two, as we consider Joseph's life, can we look at what happened to him and say that everyone who faithfully follows God will receive the same type of exaltation? In this life, maybe not. We're in the 7 years of dearth now. Yeah. No, we can't promise that everybody's going to face it. Remember in the passage, the Hebrews 11 passage, which gives both good and bad endings for people? You remember that? You had some that they put to flight the armies of the aliens by faith, and they subdued nations, and they saw their dead raised again. All these kinds of wonderful things happened. But then he says many of them went around like strangers, hiding, tortured, beaten, murdered, hiding in caves, wearing skins of animals, destitute. So it's not a guarantee that if you follow the Lord, everything's going to always work out for your best well-being, that you're going to be exalted like Joseph. That doesn't necessarily happen all the time. So should that cause us to doubt God then at that point? No, because God didn't promise that. Jesus didn't promise that. He didn't say, I'm sending you in and everything's going to work well. He says, I'm sending you as sheep in the midst of wolves, and that you're going to be hated of all men for my name's sake. So that's his promise. And if it doesn't work out that way, that's just his blessing, that we don't have to go to it. And we've been in America living in that age of his blessing and not getting the full being sin in the midst of wolves attitude coming from our culture we live in. So I think we're getting closer. I think watching what we've been seeing over the last few months has begun to pave the way for some of that. But yep, I still think we're very blessed as Christians in this country to live with that peace that we have. All right, number 3. Why is there such scant historical and archaeological evidence for Joseph? 3,700 years ago? That's a pretty good one, right? What do you think about having a foreigner in Egypt to raise to glory? Do you think people want a foreigner to be their hero, to remember? Do you think people might change their history just for that reason? Or omit their history to make it sound better than it actually was? Or make it more favorable for them rather than for somebody outside of them to be their savior? Yeah. They don't want illegal immigrants in Egypt. Well, also documents. Papyrus. You know what papyrus is? Just paper reed. Do you think that's going to last for 3,000 years? Even under the best circumstances, is it going to last for 3,000 years? No. And they probably weren't under the best circumstances. Just go over to the nation of Egypt and look at the landscape and things that when they dig up stuff and find stuff, it's buried under hot sand, and yeah, that stuff's not going to last forever, right? Okay, so that stuff will, in fact, when we did our archaeology class last year in school, one of the big issues we dealt with, and we started right at the very beginning, was the timing of all the archaeology in the Middle East. It's all based off the land of Egypt. All of it is. And there's timing. You say, well, if we look at the timing, we can find it here, and it fits with the Bible. But the problem is there are things that appear to fit with the Bible, but the timing doesn't fit because the timing's wrong in Egypt. You say, why do they base it off of Egypt? It's just because it was the major nation in the Middle East at the time, and everything kind of connected to Egypt. And so they based their history off of what happened in Egypt. And it appears that they've basically changed timings or have misinterpreted timings, archaeologists have over the years. So, and maybe they also, added to their history, and extra years got somewhere added in there too, so to make themselves look better than they might have been. All right. Last one. In what ways do the evidence for Joseph's existence in Egypt encourage you to trust the Bible? We kind of already answered this before, but do we need those things first off to help you trust the Bible? But if you're struggling through something and this give you a bit of added affirmation to help you trust the Bible? Yeah, it can. But your faith should be built on these things, right? Okay. Okay. Anything else? Any other thoughts? Yeah. Yeah, he verified by his affirmations of those things. Like the book of Jonah. I'm going to talk about that this morning in our message this morning. But Jesus talked about Jonah and the well. People go, that's a mythological story. Well, Jesus didn't say it was. He actually affirmed it. So that might be one of those big stretch of mind embrace ideas, but Jesus said it happened, and he believed it and trusted it. Remember one of the last few things he did with them after he rose from the dead, when he was trying to teach them to trust in God? He didn't say, look to miracles and signs and wonders to get your affirmation. Look to evidence to get your affirmation. That those two on the road to Emmaus that were walking, he kept himself back from them even knowing it was him. Why? Because he wanted to prove from the Scriptures that these things were so that whenever he's no longer visible to be seen anymore, they still have this book to trust in. And then he showed himself at the very end of the whole 7-mile discussion that he had with them on the road to Emmaus. He showed who he was. And then at that point, when he showed who he was, he vanished. He didn't even stay around for them to look or touch or hold or anything. And then when he went and visited with them again later that night, the other group, he did the same thing. He opened the Scripture and showed that, why are you so slow to believe what the Scripture says? And then he gave him a bit of evidence afterwards. It says that he said, give me something to eat, and made the point, spirits don't eat food, right? So this is, once again, an affirmation that the Bible itself is what we're to trust in. Not necessarily evidence, not looking for miracles and signs. We look to the book. All right, let's close in prayer. Who wants to pray? All right, Brother Fred. Your little eye twitch told me you want to pray.